disablism may seem like an aberration for those who are able-bodied or able-minded, and many people cannot understand how somebody can even hate a disabled person, possibly pity or disgust. And for many, these cases seem almost unbelievable or exceptional. But from the perspective of disabled people, this is one of the oldest forms of hatred and intolerance that we know as humans, and it is ubiquitous. In fact, it is so inbuilt into the way in which we engage in the world that it is really difficult to see. And ableism is the assumption that being able-bodied and able-minded is the preferred default of being human. Ableist attitudes are ubiquitous and ingrained in our society, and even when extreme violence is used, it is quickly dismissed as justifiable. Everywhere we turn, even on the most progressive analyses, ableism is not recognised. We live in a society, particularly neoliberal democracies, that are determined by this notion of productivity, of being a fully fledged, fully engaged citizen. And disabled people are so often framed as a burden, as less than, that they don't even, that the ideology sitting behind their disadvantaged position isn't even recognised. So I think that it is like other hate crimes. There is a political or an ideological motivation for doing so. I think because bullying the cripple or bullying the disabled person is so normalised from childhood that we don't actually recognise it as disablist violence. So just in the last 2 weeks, we've been notified of the case of Anne-Marie Smith, who was left by her carer to sit in a chair for over a year while she starved and died of sepsis. We also have the case of Willow Dunn, who is a toddler who again died this week after being starved by her father and stepmother, who also refused care. And, when the police found her, she was covered in rat bites. We also have, just in the last couple of days, the case of 2 currently unnamed young men who were found by the police after the death of their father and their only carer, who were being held basically hostage in really appalling conditions. With the death of their father, the police are not going to be pursuing that as a criminal investigation and not look at the circumstances that enabled these boys to be tortured and starved for years by their father. So we're starting to see a pattern there around abuse of disabled people and abuse of their vulnerability and dependence on others. It's only children and disabled and older people's experiences that are framed as neglect, and offenders' behaviours are framed as justifiable given the burden of caring for vulnerable people. And this is a term that is replicated over and over again in regards to disabled people, that they are a burden. So when we talk in terms of neglect and burden, we almost give permission to hate disabled people. They are something that, causes us problems. So, they're not worth our attention. What is not discussed in all of these cases and the media representation of it is the deliberate abuse and targeting of disabled people's vulnerability and dependence on others. And underlying all of these cases, and especially the public and the media's responses, is ableism. Now, disablist violence is unlike other forms of hate crime because in most cases it is much more intimate and can be easily and often framed as family violence rather than hate crime. Not only is disablist violence more likely to be perpetrated by carers, families and friends, it is also more likely to happen behind closed doors with no capable guardian to assist in helping that person, which quite controversially has given rise to this term mate crime. People within the disability community are quite opposed to this term because it seems to, again, minimise and dismiss the case and almost make it out as a joke. Instead of hate crime, it's mate crime. And mate crime refers to acts of violence against disabled people from those the victim perceives to be a friend. And these types of hate crime are difficult to address as they require the victim to not only acknowledge what is happening to them is not acceptable, but also requires a criminal response, but also requires them to accept that this person that they perceive to be a friend was in fact not a friend. And for some disabled people who have such small support networks, even the loss of a violent friend is devastating. And we see this in really horrific cases that came to the media's attention in the UK. There was a case of David Askew, who died of a heart attack in 2010. And this was after a 10-year campaign of violence from young people who David initially believed were his friends. Similarly, Kenneth Oakes, who died in 2011, died after 3 days of violent assaults from what he perceived to be his best friend, and ended up dying with 43 rib fractures. So quite extreme violence. It was also the case for Gemma Hayter, who was not only tortured, but then was killed by 5 young people. And these were all people under the age of 22 who came together as a gang to actually gang up on Gemma. Up until that point, Gemma thought she was part of the gang, not the recipient of the gang's action. The police framing of disablist violence as antisocial behaviour was at the centre of the case of Fiona Pilkington and Frankie Hardwick. And this was really the case that tipped the UK into doing much more work around hate crime because of the preceding activities of the offenders, which led to the outcome. So in this case, as with David Askew and the others, Fiona, her daughter Frankie, and her son Anthony were subjected to a decade-long campaign of violence. And this was everyday acts of antisocial behaviour over a 10-year period, and included things like having financial paperwork like checkbooks and their welfare payments stolen from their postbox. Fires were lit on their properties, people urinated on their fence, objects were thrown at their house such as rubbish and eggs and rocks. Also, near the end of this case, Fiona's son, Anthony, who also is intellectually impaired, was held at knife point by these local young people in a garden shed whilst the perpetrators attempted to force Frankie to undress. And these were quite young people and really impressionable, and the slippage into a sexual assault could have been so easy if there wasn't somebody who had intervened at that time. So the failure of the police and other agencies to protect Fiona's family led to her making the devastating decision to kill herself and Frankie in a car fire. So it was framed as a murder-suicide, but that murder-suicide came off the back of 10 years of harassment. And at one point, the police admitted that Fiona had contacted them 33 times in a single year. And yet none of those cases were linked. None of them were perceived as an ongoing campaign. The police would literally just turn up, tell people to stop doing what they're doing, and then leave. So the actions of these perpetrators and others like them also highlights this sort of unique characteristic of disablist hate speech as well. In my own research with the London Metropolitan Police Service, what I found was that the dominant theme of disablist hate speech is pathologisation, calling people moron, stupid, crippled, burdened, diseased, dirty. And what I found in that research was that the speech used linked to the actions undertaken by perpetrators. So when we use pathologising speech such as that, it links to actions around dirt and disease, such as urinating, rubbish, excrement being left at the victim's properties. The other component of disablist violence is that it is often more likely to include repeated victimisation, as we saw with some of those UK cases. And in part, this is because there is no one to intervene, but also because the mechanisms that we develop to deal with disablist violence requires a victim capable of engaging with ableist institutions such as the police, which is something some disabled people just simply cannot do. And as such, they are reliant on proxies or advocates to make their case. And unfortunately, some of those who care for disabled people, who are members of their family, are also guided by ableist assumptions themselves. So we don't hear from disabled people about their experiences. And I know from a colleague of mine who did attempt to undertake research with disabled people around their experiences of hate crime, that ethics committees and research committees are adverse to even allowing researchers to engage with disabled people. And I know when he was doing his ethics process that the committee came back and said, don't you think it's more appropriate for you to speak to the carers of these disabled people? Thankfully, we were able to push back and we were able to engage with those people. But the dominant thing was that they can't speak for themselves. They can't talk about their own experiences. Only others can talk on their behalf. So given that, we know way too little about disablist hate crime in terms of trends or patterns, because we've set barriers to disabled people reporting. They have barriers to even getting to a phone to communicate. We then have barriers to the police even perceiving this as a hate crime. So we don't know anything. We have no knowledge of this. So too few of these cases come to the media's attention. So we can't even begin to map the contours of disablist violence. We also have the problem that how disablist hate crime presents varies considerably between different types of disability. Unlike, even the category of race hate crime, racism presents in pretty much the same way, irrespective of the nationality or country of origin of the victim. But with disability, there is great variety in the types of violence that is used dependent on the type of disability of the person. So for example, while mate crime is more likely to occur with people with a cognitive or intellectual impairment, it is less likely to occur for those who have a sensory disability. In contrast, opportunistic attacks against disabled people are more likely to be committed against people whose disability is apparent. So to date, we are reliant on what other people say about disabled people's experiences of hate crime. And apart from a handful of studies, disabled people have not been asked about their experiences, nor have policing services considered what their officers need to know about how to even identify disablist hate crimes. So in addition to sort of grappling with the normalisation of disablist violence by governments and media and the public, in attempting to get a better idea of disablist hate crime, I think we have to take the first step back to hear from disabled people about their experiences and to provide them with appropriate mechanisms, not only to understand the concept of hate crime, but to empower them to report that disablist violence they experience.